guys, welcome to the Kim Iverson Show. So tonight we're welcoming back cardiologist Dr. Aseem Malhotra. We had him on the show back in January, and we had a really interesting discussion about COVID vaccines, big sugar, and statins. He's the doctor who went viral after he was on Joe Rogan's show talking about statins and how they really aren't that beneficial. Early in his career, he was villainized by the medical community for saying things like, sugar isn't good for you, which we now all know. He then was villainized for looking at data on statins and saying, hey, these aren't really that effective except making Big Pharma a ton of money. And then he later was villainized again after being first an advocate of the COVID-19 vaccines, but then after the tragic death of his father from a heart attack and doing some research, Dr. Malhotra became one of the fiercest outspoken critics of the vaccines. And we had him on about a year ago to talk about all of these controversies surrounding his career. And during that interview, he mentioned he was coming out with a film called First Do No Farm. And he mentioned the film is going to go over ways people can prevent heart disease, the leading cause of death. And he'd come back on the show to talk about it. Well, I watched the film last night and it is jaw-dropping. And honestly, every single person in America, actually in the world, needs to watch this film because it really does break down how we ended up with this corrupted medical system that is just keeping people sick rather than actually helping people stay healthy or get healthy. And I watched it and I thought, man, I got so many people in my life who need to watch this film because they're just dosing themselves up with drugs, thinking, oh, I'm so healthy because I'm taking all of these pills, to correct all of these problems I have. They're gaining weight, they're getting depressed. I mean, we're just obviously living in a very ill society. And unfortunately, the people who speak up, like Dr. Malhotra, are demonized. And this film breaks down exactly why. And I think it really is an eye-opener.
Between 2003 and 2016, fines imposed on large pharmaceutical companies for fraud and other illegal activities amounted to $33 billion.
You have to do something. We are considered acceptable collateral damage.
We're talking about many millions of people killed by research fraud in medical science.
Between 40 and 60,000 Americans died. So this is like approximately equal to the number of Americans who died in the Vietnam War, died from taking Vioxx.
We need to apply quite a big dose of skepticism to the medical literature. They know they might get $1 million, for example, for publishing the trial. And that, I don't really see how you can manage that as a conflict of interest.
You are going to be obliterated if you take on this position.
I effectively lost my job.
The thing you care about is, I don't want to lose my memory. I want to be able to do the things I normally do in life. That's what Alzheimer's robs you of.
The FDA is not going to protect doctors and the public and the insurers and Medicare from this deception about the clinical value of this drug.
If you knew, why didn't you do anything?
Patient began to verbalize feelings of killing other people, and then himself.
They are now out of control as an entity that is purely there to make money. A psychopathic entity.
Dr. Malhotra, welcome to the show. Thank you for being back. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me again, Kim.
So I watched this film last night. Really a great breakdown. I think it's a great opener for all the people out there who are dosing themselves up with tons of medications because their doctor told them to take as many medications as possible. And just really, I have so many questions about where to begin and how this corruption even happened. But first, I want to talk about the censorship on the film. You've been mentioning that the film is being censored by mainstream media and by Meta. Tell us about what's going on. Why are they blocking? How are they blocking it and why, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite shocked by this level of censorship, Kim. During the pandemic, I think I experienced my first bit of censorship when I remember I was banned by Facebook for 24 hours for suggesting that masks may not be a good idea for children. Right. And that was actually based upon a peer-reviewed study. And then the press reported on the UK. So I experienced a little bit of that, but I've never seen anything like this. So, we had a premiere ready to make a statement at the world's most famous cinema, the Leicester Square Odeon, which has, red carpet events and premieres for like James Bond movies, Mission Impossible, that kind of thing. So we had 790 people by private invite turn up for that premiere. And many of them are big name celebrity figures in the UK. And just the fact that they attended, they couldn't even believe that they were being shadow banned. Even sharing the posts was getting shadow banned by Meta. So at the moment, it seems that almost everything, it seems to be more specifically in relation to me, that anything and everything I post, whether or not it's to do with Big Pharma, is effectively getting shadow banned and people can't share. And the comments are, are countless under my post saying, we're sharing this, and immediately we're saying this is breaching community standards. Now, just to briefly understand that, because it does relate to the film, last year when I was in San Francisco, I consider America my second home, by the way. I have a lot of relatives scattered all over this country. And I was staying with some relatives in San Francisco. And one of the friends, a family friend, she works very senior at Meta. And she said that, listen, she basically told me that this independent fact-checking stuff is complete and total nonsense. She said anything that interferes with their corporate partners or their sponsors will be flagged up and shadow banned. And we know that there are financial links, probably almost certainly, between Big Pharma and Meta. So the way to overcome this, I think, Kim, is to try and go to the very root of the problem. And obviously we expose it, we talk about it like on your show. But I have someone who's very influential and powerful in the UK who knows Nick Clegg, the former Deputy Prime Minister of the UK, who's very senior in Meta, and he wants more information on this. So let's see what Nick comes back with, because I honestly think for most of them, they're just ignorant. And you mentioned obviously seeing the film. It's one of those movies that you can't unsee it once you watch it. If Mark Zuckerberg spent 2 hours watching this movie, I think it would change him, it would transform him massively. And he would realize that the trust that he's put in these institutions, whether it's a CDC, whether it's the World Health Organization, because I know that a lot of people that work in Meta have actually, they decided they were going to censor anything that countered the CDC and what the WHO were telling us. But the problem is the WHO and the CDC, and the movie obviously alludes to this problem, are actually captured by, big corporations who are, as entities, psychopathic in the way that they go about conducting their business.
Yeah. So when did the film come out?
So it was released September the 23rd was the premiere. We then, it's been released online for people to download, and that's where obviously a lot of the shadow banning is going on. But we're doing everything we can to get it out through alternative media channels to raise awareness of it. I'm somebody that's interested in policy change. The movie, as you know, is very American focused as well. And we had the US premiere actually was in Capitol Hill. Senator Ron Johnson hosted a screening of it. He loved the documentary. He said everybody should watch it. So, I'm trying to hit policymakers as well as hit the masses.
The film, I think a lot of us, especially those of us who've been, the advocates during COVID, I think people are really aware of the issues with Big Pharma. Interestingly, it's become like a right-wing conspiracy theory, right? Like for whatever reason, they've turned criticizing Big Pharma, which used to be, this was Bernie Sanders' kind of shtick for a long time, right? This was people on the left, the progressives, they were saying, oh, Big Pharma and all of their money-making interests, and they don't care about people, and they were railing against the opioid crisis and these families that were making tons of money and people were dying and they were getting addicted to all these drugs. That was previously a left-wing political position more than anything. And then when COVID hit and things started, and people on the right started to open up and say, whoa, wait a minute. Wow, there is a big problem here. Now it's like the people on the left have just completely abandoned that. They think, oh no, now you're just a big conspiracy theorist. Trust pharma. Just do whatever pharma tells, which is like it just goes to show how easily our brains are manipulated just for political tribalism. We could just abandon things we know. And now this is suddenly a right-wing conspiracy theory.
Completely, Kim, and you're right, actually. The traditional left, and certainly, listen, I'm a doctor that doesn't affiliate myself with any political party because for me it's my effectiveness and my advocacy is I think has more impact when I come from a more neutral position. But I'll be honest with you, my traditional leanings have always been left of center, partly because I'm an NHS doctor and I'm very passionate about the National Health Service in the UK. It's a religion there. But actually, as Bobby Kennedy, my good friend who features in the movie as well, points out, both the Democrats and the Republicans have been captured over the years by big corporations. And I was even shocked to learn, Kim, not so long ago, you mentioned Bernie Sanders. I was shocked to learn that Bernie Sanders apparently is the fourth largest recipient in Congress of big pharma money. Like, how has that happened?
Yeah. Yeah, isn't that crazy? Isn't that crazy? I mean, just so easily captured. I mean, and I think with the film, and this is really I want to get into, the film is scary. And I'll tell you why it's scary. Because I think those of us that have been paying attention, we know, okay, pharma is a problem. There's a problem with funding with the CDC and also whatever the regulatory bodies are in the UK. I would imagine they have a very similar issue where is it the same there? Are they funded? Like
Yeah,
the FDA. The FDA is
yeah, the
funded.
equivalent. Yeah, the equivalent of the FDA in the UK is called the MHRA. They get 86% of their funding from pharma. The FDA gets 65% of its funding from pharma. So that's a big problem.
Yeah. Okay. So we know that I think during COVID, we exposed and people were more aware of the fact that there's these issues with big pharma and maybe advertising and, with the networks and news, and they're getting tons of money from pharma. So of course they were going around scaring everybody during COVID and having the death tickers on the screens and getting everybody to, take the vaccine or we're all going to die kind of a thing. But what your film really lays out, and this is, I don't know how we're going to correct this. I got to be honest. But it lays out that the corruption is at almost every single level. I mean, it's starting with the doctor that is not, the doctors, the family practice doctors, or just any doctor that you go to is not really doing their own research. They're reliant on these pharmaceutical sales reps that come along and say, here's the latest science on our drug. And then you go to the science. Oh, the science is funded by the company who made the drug. And then, who published the science, the medical journal. But then in your film, and this is something I'd never heard of before, was then they are paid a lot of times a lot of money to publish these research, the research papers, which I did not realize was going on. And then on top of that, then you've got the regulatory body that then takes that research and says, "Oh, it looks good. We're going to go ahead and pump it out to the market." The FDA, they also are being paid by big pharma. It's every single level is. Let's start with the doctors. So, because this is our chain of command, right? So,
Absolutely.
who are these pharmaceutical representatives? What is a doctor's cut? If the doctor is going to prescribe a certain medication or not versus another medication.
I think the key point, Kim, is medical knowledge. People need to understand this, especially doctors. Medical knowledge is under commercial control, but most doctors don't know that. So the medical journals that doctors rely upon, and by the way, I understand this because I was one of those doctors almost, having blind faith in if it's published in the New England Journal of Medicine, the number one impact medical journal in the world, or the Lancet, or JAMA, that it must be gospel scientific truth. Right. And nothing could be further from the truth. And one of obviously the people that we interviewed in the movie, we got some very, very credible, commentators. One of them is a former editor of the British Medical Journal, a giant in medical publishing, Fiona Godley. And she basically says that we have to have a skepticism about what's published in journals because the journals themselves are businesses. So one of the examples that's used is the example of Vioxx. Now, Vioxx was an anti-inflammatory drug, a blockbuster drug when it was marketed and released in the late 90s in the US predominantly to start with, thought to be better as a painkiller than ibuprofen. And the drug company said it was better because it had less GI gastrointestinal side effects like stomach ulcers or acid reflux or whatever. It ultimately was proven not to be the case, but what was worse is that they hid data. Merck was a drug company at the time. They hid data showing that it at least doubled the risk of cardiovascular events, heart attack, stroke, death, and ultimately was thought to have killed at least 60,000 Americans, which is more Americans that were killed in the Vietnam War. But what happened during the process of the litigation, which was involved in from Harvard, was that internal emails revealed that the chief scientist of Merck said, paraphrasing, that it's a shame about the cardiovascular effect of the drug. In other words, we know about the heart attack risk, but the drug will do well and we will do well when it was being marketed. So they knew about it. They still allowed it to be marketed. When the FDA realized there was a problem, they wrote to Merck and said, you need to put a black box warning on your packaging. Not only did Merck ignore that, they then purchased more reprints from the New England Journal of Medicine where the original trial was published. So they could get it in the hands of every single doctor in the US to say this is a great drug and it's better than ibuprofen, once they even knew, or even the FDA knew there was a problem. So what happens with a medical journal is, and again, this is something that isn't talked about, medical journals often will receive millions of dollars from the drug companies to sell back to them reports, their original trial reports that are published in the journal. And then that's used as marketing material. So this is a huge, it's a conflict of interest that editors try and mitigate. But as Fiona Godley says in the documentary, how is that possible? It's very difficult for an editor, knowing that they're going to get millions of dollars or millions of pounds into their journal from a drug company, to not, affect their decision making about whether or not to publish a trial. The other issue as well is that the peer reviewers who peer review the studies that are published don't have actual access to the raw clinical trial data. So they have to believe the summary reports of the drug companies that have designed the trials, analyzed the trials, and even interpreted the trials for the purposes of making money. It's really that bad, Kim. That's when you said it's scary, it's jaw-dropping. It is very, very scary. And I've been aware of this for many, many years and been writing articles about it. And in fact, before the pandemic, on 3 occasions, using mainstream media in the UK, the Guardian newspaper, the BBC and the Daily Mail, the I newspaper, because I spoke in the European Parliament, calling for, exposing all this stuff. I called for a public inquiry. I said, this is so huge. It needs a level of inquiry that went into investigating the Iraq war and the whole weapons of mass destruction nonsense that we were fed. I said, it's this big. And I wrote about this before the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic happens. Big Pharma come in. We were then duped into taking this medical product, which we know now should probably never have been given to a single human in the first place, going back to the square one on the data reanalysis by independent scientists. And once that clicked for me and I started seeing those harms, I already knew how we got here. But what's really sad, Kim, from a personal perspective, is if we had won that battle to get the inquiry into Big Pharma, and very simply, one of the most important things that any legislator, any president needs to do is to say, from now on, drug companies can develop drugs, but they should be no longer allowed to test them themselves, and they need independent evaluation. And if we had that before the pandemic, this so-called COVID mRNA vaccine, genetic therapy, would not have been approved in the first place for any human being. That is the saddest story of all of this for me, Kim. Personally, I lost my dad, obviously, because of the COVID vaccine, but it's affecting so many people. But if we don't use this as an opportunity now, and obviously the film is one medium to get this message across to people, then it's only going to get worse, because I know that the business model of Big Pharma is to get as many people taking as many drugs for as long as possible. I know this because I debated the CEO of AstraZeneca in the Cambridge University Union in 2019, where they put a motion forward and I was opposing. We need more new drugs, which in effect means we need more people taking more drugs. If they could, the entity that is Big Pharma, that is psychopathic, they will get to a stage now where if they could, they will manipulate the law, where they'll start mandating cholesterol-lowering drugs for children in school, as in you can't send your child to school unless they're taking a statin. If they could do that, they would, and we need to stop them.
Oh, gosh. I mean, it just basically comes down, it sounds like Big Pharma has a monopoly. They have a monopoly on the entire process from start to finish. And you've mentioned this before on this show. You also mentioned it during the film, that they're in it to make money. I mean, they have a legal obligation to their shareholders. They don't have a legal obligation, unfortunately, to the people who they dose up with their drugs. I mean, they could get caught. There maybe could be some liability depending on the drug, depending on if they were giving immunity. Unfortunately, with COVID-19, they were. But they are obligated to just make money for their shareholders. And that is what they're out there to do. And they're just pumping us full of meds. And they've got, but the scary thing is the monopoly they have on the entire medical, I mean, from start to finish, they have a monopoly on it, starting with the data. Like you just mentioned, they own their own data. They're the ones, they develop the drug, they do the clinical trials, they test, and then they own the data. And the only way we can get the data is if we sue them in order to cause discovery. And a judge says, you have to give us your data. That's the only time we get it, but they're not even, I mean, what kind of data? Do they have to release the data at least to the regulatory bodies, like to the FDA? Do they have to release it?
Yeah, in theory, yes, Kim, but it doesn't happen very often. So what happens is the FDA, who get most of their funding, or at least 50%, I mean, certainly the BMJ investigation 2022 reveals 65% of the funding of the FDA comes from Big Pharma, is that they get summary reports of their trial data. And often that trial data is very extensive in terms of it can often be thousands, if not tens of thousands of pages long, where you've got almost daily reports coming back from every participant in the clinical trial to Big Pharma. They then curate that information, give summary reports to the regulator, who gets most of their money from pharma. They don't want to bat the hand that feeds them. And
Right.
therefore, they're not independent in their assessment. And of course, a lot of these people in these public, body roles, Kim, they go on, commissioners of the FDA go on to get very lucrative jobs when they leave the FDA with Big Pharma. So they are thinking ahead of their own personal future. But
Right.
ultimately, it's all self-destructive. You mentioned before also this legal obligation to make profit for their shareholders. You're absolutely right. But, going back to square one, the United States of America was actually founded on anti-corporate sentiment. You fought off the British colonialists, the British East India Company. And very early on, if you go back to after America, when America was founded, businesses could only form, governments only allowed businesses to form if you were producing a product that was beneficial to society. We've now gone from that situation to a situation where you can market unhealthy products to children when you think about big food and what they are doing. So we need to just think about, how did this happen? It's happened very slowly by stealth over many, many years. Unfortunately, in the recent past, it's been accelerated by, I'm sure, well-intentioned policies by the likes of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the UK to give big industry less regulation. The problem is, you're giving less regulation, less control to entities that are psychopathic. And that was always going to be a very bad idea. Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize winning Chicago economist, who was the most influential man when it comes to economic policy with Ronald Reagan, he is quoted, paraphrasing, he's basically said in the past, wait for this, and people will find this shocking. I give it in lectures, and people can't, we've got to understand how we got here, right? He said, it is immoral for big corporations to put people ahead of profit. Let me repeat that. It is immoral for corporations to put people ahead of profits. If that's the culture and the mindset of a lot of these people in these roles, it's going to be, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that's going to end up in a very, very bad mess. And that's where we are right now.
I don't even know, did you even mention Ronald Reagan in the film? Because I was thinking of Ronald Reagan during the film. And I was thinking of the deregulation. But I don't remember hearing his name at all. But I just remember, yeah, okay. So you didn't bring him up, but I was cursing him throughout watching. I was thinking this was
Kim,
part of the deregulation.
That means you understand that. Yeah, absolutely. You're 100% right. And I think that conversation in the United States needs to change because deregulation has been pushed on people to such a level where it's been used as a tool to make people think that government is interfering with their personal freedoms. But what's happened is personal freedoms of the general public are being impeded by these big corporations, who are basically free to deceive, free to manipulate, freedom to exploit, freedom to dominate. It's not a free market. That's what we're dealing with. And you said it's a monopoly, Kim. I agree with you entirely. It's more than a monopoly. It's now a tyranny, because it's got to a situation where doctors who know what's going on are afraid to speak out. And that's what, when you have a tyranny, when people are afraid to say what they think, and when everybody's, when people are being silent, that's when you have a real oppressive tyranny. And that's how powerful they are. I know many politicians in the UK in different parties, former government ministers who I've spoken to about the COVID vaccine since we last spoke, met them, got them converted just with the evidence, because they listened to me and they looked at it and they were like, we can't unsee this anymore. And they said to me, Aseem, we're now going to speak out. But last minute, they were going to go to the media. They got scared. They got frightened. So this is bigger than a president or any prime minister. This is the power of these corporations. So the way through, like any revolution or any sort of exposing the injustice, Kim, is actually through channels like this, through the mainstream media, through alternative independent media, through ripple effect through the masses. We collectively as citizens are the people that are going to win this battle, but we have to all come together and we all have to start speaking out.
Thank you so much for watching. This was just a clip from the longer, larger show that you can catch Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern at KimIversonShow.com. That'll route you to the platform where you need to be in order to get the full uncensored show every Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Click on that link, watch the full interview. See you there.